I would like to introduce our panel. First, Dave Regan, who's the president of UHW SEIU. Dave is responsible for a lot of things, almost all of them good. Some people would say some bad. I think they're mostly wrong. But he's also responsible in many ways for the existence of the center. And not just him, of course, the executive board of United Healthcare Workers West, the staff of United Healthcare Workers West, some of whom are sitting back here, and of course, the 105,000 members of United Healthcare Workers West, SEIU. Okay. Scott Jenkins, sitting right here, from Teamsters for a Democratic Union, and he's also our current activist in residence at the Center for Work and Democracy. Marcia Howard and Gretta Callahan, here and here, from the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, Local 59. These are two people that I've come to admire greatly from our work in Minneapolis, and people who I hope that we get to continue working with many years into the future. Marcia and Gretta. Daphna, Thier, and Grace Reckers, right here. From the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee. They also have other jobs. They do other things, but we're very pleased to have them here, and we look forward to hearing about their sort of new model for doing organizing work. Tom Hintze from United Auto Workers Region 6. He is poking around in Arizona, looking to do some good work here, and we hope to be working with him as he does that. So, you know, UAW is in the midst of a revival, and we hope that revival carries Tom to some victories here in Arizona. So, Tom Hintze. And finally, Emma Kinema from the Communication Workers of America. She's also the one organizing the Alphabet Workers Union at Google. Which is, of course, a very ambitious effort to crack the tech industry. Emma Kinema from the Communication Workers of America. So we're going to give each of these panelists or each of these organizations 10 minutes to introduce themselves. They are all here for a reason. We think they are doing special work that is actually pointing the way to solving some of the labor movement's problems. All of them are on different tracks, but we think that when we think about a labor movement, that necessarily means lots of people pushing forward in their own ways. They can support each other, they can do things solidaristically, but sometimes you need to also find your own way, and each of these organizations, people, organizers are doing that. But they are here to tell you something about one of the ways that we can think about how to rebuild the labor movement for the 21st century. So we're going to give each of them 10 minutes, and then we are going to have a bit of a roundtable discussion where I hope that they also ask questions of each other, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, and then we're going to be done. This is the longest panel on the thing. There's a good reason. We've been waiting to hear from these people for a long time, and we look forward to a good conversation. So let's welcome everybody. And let's start with Dave Regan from UHW SEIU.
All right. Hi, everybody. Nice to see people. I'm going to make sure I keep myself on track here. So, thanks, Michael, and thank you to the center. Dave Regan with SEIU UHW. We are a local union of about 110,000 hospital workers, predominantly across the state of California, and we're now doing work here in Arizona as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. I thought it made sense to start if the overall topic is the resurgence of the labor movement. Some people here may be aware, and I'm guessing some people aren't aware, that the votes were counted yesterday in what I think is likely to be the largest union election in America this year. 19,000 student assistants at the California State University system petitioned the Public Employee Relations Board in California to have an election. The unit is 19,000 people, and they voted yesterday 7,050 to 202 to organize themselves. It is the first unit of undergraduate students, to the best of my knowledge, that's been organized anywhere. And I just think it's a really exciting thing, because by definition, if you're talking about undergrads, you're talking about young people, you're talking about people who are at a certain point in their life, and you're talking about creating an actual bargaining unit in the largest public university system anywhere in America. And I want to just mention, this is the local union is called CSU EU, Education Union. It's also part of SEIU. The president of the local is a woman named Catherine Hutchinson, and I'm a big fan, and I just want to mention one thing about her, is that her executive board of the regular full-time workers in CSU was opposed to doing this election. And they were opposed to doing this campaign in this election because the local union currently has 12,000 members who are full-time, not student workers, but regular workers. And they, like we're all familiar with, wondered what happens to our position as the leaders of this organization if all of a sudden we got a bigger group of students who are now, a numerical majority, and it caused some controversy. And to Catherine's credit, she soldiered through that, won people over, did the campaign, and this was done yesterday. So my job here is to talk about what we do, not what Catherine does, but I couldn't resist mentioning that. So here's the way I think about this and the way we talk about this in UHW, and I'd put it this way to this group, that we have what I would call an order of magnitude problem. Just a couple of quick little numbers, and these are not precise, but I think everybody will get the point because they're basically correct. The U.S. workforce is 150 million people. There are 15 million union members in America, all unions, all sectors. A majority of those 15 million union members are public employees of one variety or another. They are not private sector workers. 10% of the U.S. workforce, therefore, is organized, most of them public employees. 6% of the private sector workforce is part of a union. And what we all, I think, come up with is this idea that back in the days of the CIO, right, the power of the American labor movement was concentrated in core industries that really dominated, the economy through the core of the private sector. Last year, in this, we've talked about this kind of upsurge in awareness and class consciousness or consciousness of class or whatever it might be. But to go from a 10% movement to an 11% movement, we have to add 1.5 million union members under contract. Workforce of 150 million people, 1.5 is 1%. Last year, in the resurgence of private sector organizing currently underway, all unions in the NLRB, all elections, 100,000 people total voted whether or not to join a union. One more point of unionization is 1.5 million people. 100,000 people voted. They didn't all win. And we all know half of those who vote to get the union never get a contract. So we have at least an order of magnitude problem. How do we rebuild this thing? It's simple arithmetic. And if the hole you are in is that big, our view is you got to try a whole bunch of things, because no organization, no institution, no entity in the world can get at least, at a minimum, one order of magnitude better unless we're doing a whole lot of stuff we're not doing right now. And so this calls into, the discussion, all kinds of things. So what I want to share with you is we are believers in experimentation. We recognize that we're a pretty big organization, and, we are appreciative that we are at a scale in terms of our organization and the resources that we have that we're able to do some things, and we don't believe we can succeed unless lots of people out there are succeeding in all kinds of ways, and we have to have just a quantum leap in terms of the activity that's going on. So scale matters, resources matter, people matter, leadership matters. All of these things matter. First thing I want to share with you is our executive board, and by the way, I want to acknowledge Sonia Allen Smith, who is a radiologist in Kaiser. She works in the radiology department. She's a member of our executive committee, a leader of our organization, and she's on our board and is part of the decision that we made that we set a goal to organize 25,000 members over the next 3 years during the term of this board. And so, again, when you think about that, that would be 25% growth basically in our organization. You can't get to that level of growth unless you're campaigning for probably twice as many workers. And so in a 100,000 person organization, if you want to grow by 25,000, you got to campaign to 50,000. But what is amazing right now is we can imagine campaigns. That's what's different now that wasn't true 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when you just couldn't imagine going to, for instance, Fresno, California, where the largest non-union hospital, anywhere between Sacramento and Los Angeles is 8,000 people, totally non-union. And all of a sudden, there's a sense, we have 1,500 Kaiser members who live in that community. There's a sense we can organize this place. That didn't exist 3 years ago. It didn't exist 5 years ago. And I don't know that it's going to exist 5 years from now. We have a window right now, and that's part of what we're trying to say. But the first thing we're doing is we're saying to ourselves, we're going to throw everything we got at trying to organize at a level that we've never been capable of doing before, and it's going to take the total reorientation of our organization, and it's going to take a lot of resources to do it. One thing I want to mention, and I think we're all a little hesitant sometimes to talk about money and financial resources in the union. It's kind of a subject that gets talked about in the corners or at the bar, but not often enough out in the open. And I just want to say to people that if we're going to dig out of this order of magnitude problem, it's going to take a level of financial commitment that we have just not made in decades and decades and decades. And when the mine workers and John Lewis created the SEIU, the mine workers paid for it, and they spent a ton of money to get that done, and we got to find the resources to do it. So our organization, I'm going to show you a little bit of our underwear here. We have a budget. You could go online and see it or pull the files, but our annual budget is $125 million. And we're prepared to spend a third of that, if need be, if we can find the campaigns to get this done. Our members pay relatively high dues. 40% of our members give to our hard money political action fund. And the point I want to make here is that workers and regular people will put up the money if we have the hard conversation and we're willing to, again, let's be frank with each other. If we want to change the world, we want to change our lives, you're not going to do it on the cheap. And we're fighting people like Google and Amazon, hospitals, whoever, that got tons and tons of money. So that's one thing, 25,000. Second thing I want to mention is that we have a non-NLRB thing called Healthcare Rising Arizona. 2,000 plus people are now paying dues of $20 a month here in Arizona to build a non-collective bargaining organization. There's more of that going on. You heard about the fast food stuff yesterday. The one thing I want to say about this is that these things don't pay for themselves. They have to be subsidized by other parts of the organization. I think they're experiments worth doing, but you have to get to a scale in non-collective bargaining, direct, voluntary type organizations where people can come and go at a whim. It's a real problem, but I think if you, again, order of magnitude, we got to try it. We need to do it, but we also have to recognize that it's going to have to be subsidized for a period of time. Third thing, you heard about this yesterday, we created a co-op called Allied Up. I thought Jerry Davis's comments yesterday were really interesting about how the world has changed and corporations are shrinking, and even companies now that build cars employ 1,000 people, not 50,000 people. And the thing about co-ops, in addition to being a different corporate form and have worker ownership, is that if you can organize people into a co-op and figure out how to contract with clients, you eliminate employer opposition. And if you can organize the co-op and figure out how to grow in any sector, we're taking out our biggest obstacle to organizing, again, employer opposition. And so I just would add to this, on top of everything else, that co-ops are important because they can be a way to evade the most difficult part of the unionization process. Fourth thing, experiments. Direct democracy. And here in Arizona, in 2016, I was talking with somebody at lunch today. I'm not from California, went to California. You hear all about these ballot initiatives, and I thought, well, surely you must have to go through some kind of a screening process to get on the ballot. And then I learned, obviously, that all you got to do is have the signatures, and you can put any damn thing on the ballot you want to put on. And I asked myself, why don't we use this more often? Back then we were playing a lot of defense. So we created an organization, again, another experiment called the Fairness Project. We've run 35 state-level ballot campaigns across the United States in the last 7 years, mostly minimum wage and Medicaid expansion. We've won 33 of them. In 2016, the minimum wage in Arizona was $8.05 an hour. Today it's $14.45 and indexed to inflation. That's a cool thing, but then here's what I worry about. So $12,000 a year for a full-time minimum wage worker, and 1 million people got a pay raise. That cost us $1.5 million to win that. We bargained the Kaiser contract, we bargained contracts. I have never in my life come within 10 country miles of bargaining $12,000 for 1 million people. But direct democracy made it happen. American workers will do stuff that legislatures won't do. Voters will do stuff that legislatures won't do. The value of what we've won across America, minimum wage, Medicaid expansion, is now approaching $25 billion per year. On a $75 million investment, we got to think differently about resources. How do we build organizations around that? Last thing I want to say, and then I'll get out of the way here. People matter, leadership matters. If we're going to deal with this order of magnitude problem, we need tens of thousands of rank and filers who are prepared to talk to non-union workers all across America. We don't have them. We don't have them. I don't think the UAW has them. We can't keep up with the campaigns we can see in our own organization right now in California. Workers want unions, and we don't have the people to talk to them. And we have to solve this problem. And I welcome the opportunity to follow up with anybody, anywhere, about how do we build a cadre of at least 25,000 trained rank and file workers to talk to non-union people all across America. In our organization, and Sonia will tell you this, we're trying to create 600 right now. 600 people who are ready to go out and talk to these non-union workers. We've already put 300 plus through what we call an organizing boot camp. We're doing another one in April. But it's not just you got to have the people, we then have to be able to get them off work. And that's not always easy with our employers. So we've got tons of resource challenges. We've got an order of magnitude problem, but we also have conditions that I would argue are qualitatively different than anything we've ever had before. We've got to throw everything we have at this. That's what we're doing to experiment. Thanks for listening. Thanks.
Well, hello, I'm Marcia Howard. I am the first vice president of Minneapolis Federation of Teachers Local 59, and I'm also a community member at George Floyd Square
Thank you. And I'm Gretta Callahan. I am a kindergarten teacher on release, serving as president of the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers. And as a kindergarten teacher, I do not think it's developmentally appropriate for us all to be sitting this long. So if any of you need to get up or do a shake break, I'm happy to lead you through it. And so Marcia and I are deeply rooted in the Minneapolis public schools and unions, and it wasn't always that way. Our union was a pop machine union for decades and decades, and if you don't know what that means, you put a quarter in, you get something out. We were not organized at all. And we both have our own individual stories, which we're going to kind of share, of how we collided and how the MFT became what it is now and what our city is doing. I did not grow up in a union family. I only became a teacher because I wanted to spend more time with my son when I was a single mom. And I started my career in a charter school, which I did not know was a no-no. And it was the worst kind of charter school you can imagine. Like turning kids away after the funding cutoff dates, no special ed teacher, no librarian, no nurse, no nothing. And when 3 brave teachers spoke up about what was happening to our kids, the board got us all together in a room. The board is a hand-picked board, and fired these 3 teachers on the spot in front of us. It was the scariest moment of my life, and I eventually got out of there because, like all charter schools, it got shut down, and ended up in the Minneapolis public schools. Overnight, I made $20,000 more. We had a librarian, we had a nurse. We don't turn children away, that's not a thing. And the difference was a union. So I knew nothing about unions, didn't grow up in a union family, and I realized this power. And I taught at the poorest school in our district. And me, as a baby, untenured teacher who didn't know any better, there was an article written called "The Worst Teachers Teach in the Poorest School." And it named my school specifically. And our own superintendent, who was like BFFs with our union president at the time, really bashed all the teachers in this article. And morale was so low across the district, and I just angrily wrote a response to the editor, really laying out the reality of a school like mine, where I had 27 kids in September, 27 kids in May when our test scores are deciding if we're a good teacher or not. But only 2 of those kids were the same because of high mobility and homelessness. And it was published. It was the most read op-ed that year in our local paper. And the next day, the superintendent came to the school to put me on administrative leave. And my union president, her bestie, walked in and saved my job that day. And it was another moment of, oh, this is the path to securing the schools our students deserve. A union is the answer. And this was 2014. And so Marcia and I didn't even know each other yet. And somebody said, hey, you should run for something in the union. I was like, okay. Fast forward to 2020. May 15th, I was elected president. This is before the public lynching of George Floyd in our city. This is before the uprising. This is before our district put through a comprehensive district redesign that moved 10,000 kids overnight into different schools. And all our stories are so relevant, and Marcia will share hers, because it also is a really good example for how quickly things can change. We hadn't had a strike in 52 years. Our city is like a union city, but no one was withholding work. Now, we had a strike 2 years ago, the first time in 52 years. We are now in an alignment collective with unions who are all taking strike votes in March across the Twin Cities. But together, us colliding in 2020 was such a blessing to this city and to our public schools. And Marcia will share more, and then we'll collide again.
Yeah, it collided all right. In 2020, I was probably on my 22nd year of being an English teacher in Minneapolis. I taught at Roosevelt, which is about 1.5 miles away from 38 in Chicago, now known as George Floyd Square. On May 25th, a student of mine filmed the lynching of George Floyd. Her mama called me. The next day, we saw thousands of people enter our neighborhood, and I went out there and literally saw what was happening. I got on Snapchat, and frankly, I shouldn't admit this, but I got up there and I said, you all have passed, school is over, practice social distancing, and seek justice. And I stayed out there. This has been the longest political occupation in American history. We are still at George Floyd Square. We say no justice, no street. My principal showed up somewhere in early June and asked if I had been on a Zoom, and I'm like, this man don't know I ain't even back at school. I was still getting paid. But here's what's really interesting. He figured that out, and my union figured it out. And then one day we saw a sea of blue, and my union marched into George Floyd Square, and they have been with the movement ever since. They have stood with us. They've been there under fire. And I had something that I actually wanted to talk about, but after seeing this morning, we were talking about what will it take to win? What type of coalitions that we have to forge? The fact that it's a ragtag bunch of ardent leftists being supported by educators who put their bodies on the line. Like during the Derek Chauvin trial, if you're not aware, we were under fire. Even during the first commemoration of his life, we were under fire, and union members were there. We had carpenters, SEIU, CIO, SAG-AFTRA. There were union members with us the entire time, and still are with us the entire time. So if we want to talk about coalition, say Tool, which has been referenced here, is in George Floyd Square. So that is where we sought shelter when things were getting rough. They let us use that building, and the doors got bullet riddled. But even now, a week ago, we had an alignment meeting there. So we had community organizations for rent stabilization. We had Isaiah, say Tool, SEIU, the AFSCME, the amount, what is it? The transit workers, they were also there. I can just go chapter and verse with all of these unions and organizations that are aligned, y'all. We're aligned to the point where it's kind of, we're doing a lot of cloak and dagger, because now the powers that be understand how much power we wield. Now, we don't want to get an inflated sense of importance, because again, it's about scale. It's a numbers game, right? Not everybody in Minneapolis is organized, but they're trying. We had the Uber and Lyft drivers actually are doing doing political action, and they're getting us to stand with them. Trader Joe's, who was it? Was it Trader Joe's that was with us? The baristas that are with us? Starbucks, they're doing their strike votes in our offices at Minneapolis Federation of Teachers. And people keep asking what's going on in the Midwest, more specifically, what's in the water in Minneapolis? Why is it that this resurgence of very young folk, these baby union members, and again, they may, like he said, half and half, they may try to do it, they get pushback from corporations, we understand that. But what we have noticed that since 2020, the union being in collaboration with those of us who were in the street fighting for Black lives, the same teachers that were with us in the streets on 35W, on Lake Street, on University, while the city was burning, when it came time for them to fight for themselves, they stood up for themselves. They stood up for themselves because they had had practice. And the same people that are trying to organize, it's because they've had practice, whether it's with Workers' Defense and other, leftist Antifa type organization. These same people are baristas and bartenders and auto workers and actors. These are the workers of Minneapolis. And so because they have gone step by step down these streets, putting their bodies and their freedom, mind you, online, it's Scantron work. It's bubble sheet for them to start standing up for themselves. And what's really going to be important is that if they get trained to stand up for themselves, then they can train other people. And one thing I want to make clear, as much as people make a connection between what we were doing in 2022 when we went on strike, and I have always said, oh, those teachers were trained. I told them that when we were outside. But inside with the table game was my president, and I do not want to dismiss all the organizing that y'all did before we went out on strike in 2022. It took so much organizing to get people to be invested in themselves. I've been in this district for 25 years, and we had gone 5 years without a raise. And she led us in a historic strike where we had the highest pay raise and historic pay raise that we had ever had. And I thank you for it. Thank you very much.
Stop that. No, first of all, stop that right now. Marcia led the streets. And the beautiful thing about all this, I mean, y'all are from badass organizations, so you get it. But we love talking about this because in December of 2021, our strike was in March of 2022. In December of 2021, we all sat around a planning table and said, we think we can be on strike by 2025. That's how, first of all, the boss is the best organizer. We all know that. So it happened very quickly. But then we were on the streets for 3 weeks. We woke up a city that had literally been on lockdown. And everyone got to see us joyful, playing music, dancing on the streets for 3 weeks. And that sort of joy in reclaiming your power has spread so far. And so just in the last 2 years, we have seen strike vote after strike vote after strike vote of the unions around us. So it can happen quickly, and all you have to do is work together. Yeah.
Have to stand up. I'm tiny. I'm actually on my tippy toes. Hang on. There we go. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you all. My name is Daphna Tier, and I work at the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. I'm one of 4 full-time staffers. We have very, very small budget, not in the millions, very low 6 digits. And we started in March 2020. We're a very young organization. We started as a Google form for desperate workers who were in dire straits, who were being sent to work, to get sick, to die, and who didn't know what to do. And Ben Fong mentioned earlier today, it's a joint project of the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers, UE, and the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. And the workers that were reaching out to us were in non-union workplaces, so they didn't have a union to go out and fight with for PPE or for hazard pay or for remote working, or a guarantee even that if they are furloughed, they'll have a job to return to. And we pulled in several incredible union organizers from around the country, and we began connecting them on a volunteer basis to workers. We used a remote and distributive model, and we taught workers that were anywhere in the country about organizing. And workers, very quickly, they learned how to have organizing conversations with their own coworkers, how to chart their own workplaces, develop strategy, and build a campaign with escalating tactics, and respond to these dire conditions. And they won protections for themselves. What usually a union would do, they did for themselves. And today, we have a network of hundreds of volunteers all across the country. We have an extremely well-developed system of distributive organizing using technical applications to track our organizing and move volunteers very quickly into action. So unlike most unions, we're actually really, really agile because of this distributed model of organizing. So a worker reaches out to us, and within 72 hours, they will have gotten a call. Someone will call them just to talk and hear and write down notes and learn about their workplace, about the issues they're facing, about their coworkers, how much support they have they talked to their coworkers at all, or are they completely alone, or do they have a group already around them? And we'll then look at where they are and the kind of workplace that they've got and the amount of workers that they have and all of that, and we'll decide, and when I say we, I mean volunteers. We'll look at all that and say, okay, find the right organizer for that, pair them together. Sometimes it's a set of organizers, and that organizer will then shepherd them through this process of organizing. And I say shepherd, but I really mean following their lead and giving them some of the wisdoms that so many unions have had over the years, and passing it on directly to workers and placing primacy on training them so that they themselves are doing the organizing and they themselves are doing the work, and ultimately they're developing democratic structures, organizing committees that are completely based on worker leadership and worker ownership, and campaigns that reflect that. And some of the top industries that come our way are food service and hospitality workers. That's the number one. Then there's healthcare workers, under that grocery and retail workers, and finally nonprofit workers, a lot of nonprofit workers. So mostly underrepresented sectors in terms of union representation. And in 2023, I'll just give you the most recent stats that we have, but we supported 447 campaigns that took at least one form of collective action. 47 of our campaigns won their demands. And just to show kind of a sense of like the trajectory, in 2021, the highest, the kind of like peak came in December of 2021 with a little over 50 campaigns taking collective action. But at the height of 2023, the peak was November, and you might think, oh, that happened shortly after a number of other strikes. We had twice that, we had doubled the number of campaigns that took collective action. So more than 100 campaigns in November. We also have increasingly, so at the beginning we were just doing PPE, dire straits organizing, but now a majority of people that come to us, they want something longer lasting. They want a contract. And so more and more people say to us what they want is a union, and we last year handed over to unions or labor organizations 71 union drives that represent over 7,000 workers, which I know sounds like small tuppence compared to some of the big unions represented here, but this is, new terrain and done with shoestring budget and very few, just like a few hundred volunteers. And we're currently supporting 15 additional union drives that are either independent or they're pre-majority unions, representing an additional 2,300 workers. And at the moment, we have currently 200 active campaigns. And I'll just say that after the writers' strike in the summer, the actors, the auto workers, each one of those strikes brought a wave of people, dozens of workers reaching out to us, and each time we get hit with this wave through this momentum basically, we respond very quickly, and we respond to every worker, and I think that's what's important to say about EWOC, right, is that at its core, because it's driven by self-organizing, we can do these things very quickly. So, and a lot of what happens is that workers will come to us, and then we'll train them, and then they become the trainers. And they train their coworkers, and then they train other workers in other places. And that's why this model is so scalable and requires so little overhead. And it creates these campaigns that are both deeply rooted in their workplaces and easy to proliferate. So it's like deep roots, but a wide canopy. And I would argue that this model is kind of unique in meeting this moment. And I'm going to pass it on to Grace, who's one of our volunteers. There's actually a couple of volunteers also in the audience, to talk a little bit more about the important contribution on that model for maybe the wider labor movement.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks, Daphna. My name is Grace. I just have to point out, there are 3 people who live in Minneapolis on this panel, and I just love that. So I'm coming here from Minneapolis. I am an EWOC volunteer, like Daphna said. I'm also an organizer at the Office and Professional Employees International Union. It's kind of my day job and my night job, as we know how that goes. I have been an organizer with OPEIU since 2018. Organizing sometimes feels like the only thing that I know how to do, honestly, the only skill that I have, to be honest. But I say this because I seemingly spend about 95% of my time trying to figure out how to organize more people more deeply. A lot of what Dave and others brought up on this panel is how do we reach more people, how do we scale up? I know we're getting tired of thinking about that and talking about that, but that is why I became an EWOC organizer. My full-time job is to do the same thing, but I saw that we were not doing enough and we needed to do more. I was talking with some people at lunch today about oftentimes what happens is OPEIU gets organizing leads from other unions that they can't take on, and then we pass them on to EWOC because OPEIU can't take them on. I wanted to be on the other side of that because I knew that that couldn't last. Like, we needed to keep organizing. So Daphna gave a little bit of a background as to how we operate at EWOC. Like she said, there are advanced organizers who then train up other volunteers who want to learn how to organize. The goal is to then have those volunteer organizers who are learning in the process to go out and talk with their coworkers. Our goal, as many of us have understood, is to organize ourselves out of jobs. This is a volunteer position, so I'm more than happy to have other people step up and take my position in that role. The effect of EWOC is not just to win campaigns. It is, which we do, as you heard. We have a lot of campaign victories. But it is to create a base of people who are prepared to go out and do the work that we actually know how to do to sustain the movement, to go out and hit the streets, as Marcia and Gretta said, to go out and actually join in coalition building. That's what we at EWOC do. So let's create a base of grassroots organizers who are ready to take on campaigns, respond to crises in moments that need them, and fill in where the labor movement needs support. We are not filling in to challenge existing unions. We are there to work alongside them. EWOC is not a union, it's not a worker center, it's not a service provider, but we are born out of a moment that called for us, and it called for rapid organization and militancy on a grassroots level. The best way to achieve the kind of scalable organizing that so many of us have talked about and have wondered about is to train each other and to partner with the existing labor unions that need it. I don't know if this is the kind of like interactive environment we're supposed to be asking the audience questions, but I am curious to hear from you all. What do you all think is the core principle of organizing? Does anybody have an answer? You can shout it out or raise it. Sorry? Relationships? I'm looking for a key answer. Yeah? Say it again. Lead by listening. Yep. Where do you have those? Where do you build relationships? One-on-ones. Yes. Okay. If you were a committee of mine that I was working with, I'd be maybe a little disappointed, but we'll get there. So one-on-one conversations are the absolute backbone, thank you, Angela, of the labor movement, of organizing. Nothing happens until we talk to each other. This is the key that we all need to take away. This is what Dave brought up. How are we going to talk to 25,000 workers? You have to do so in one-on-one conversations. The people in this room can't make that all happen on our own. The existing labor movement or the existing labor unions can't do that all on its own. EWOC can't do that all on its own, but we are here to train that base of organizers who can go out and talk to their coworkers and tell their coworkers to do the same. So as we heard, 6.9% of the private sector workers are in unions. 36% of public sector, which makes up about 11.2% of workers. We know that's not enough. We don't need to harp on that too much more. Hopefully many of you are here to get answers about how we solve that issue. Let's scale this work up. Let's do so in the ways that we know how, which is to build relationships, to train other organizers, and to raise expectations in our workplace and in our unions. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Tom Hintze. I'm an international rep with UAW. I work for the union's political department and for Region 6, which includes 9 western states, including Arizona, so happy to be in the region. And we represent 100,000 active and retired workers in the region. Many of those folks are in higher education in the public sector. Some are also in auto, aerospace. We represent casino dealers on the Strip in Vegas. We represent nonprofit workers and legal service workers. You all are probably expecting to hear me talk about the stand-up strike, but I'm not going to do that, really. I could tell you about the coyotes I chased off the picket line in Reno with our workers who are on strike at a PDC in Reno with General Motors. I could talk to you about our members who got confronted by scab drivers in Los Angeles and had guns pulled on them and were told to move out of the way so that the trucks could make deliveries. But I was not a part of the organizing vision for the strike. Obviously, people have heard a lot about that. But I do want to talk about this issue of organizing workers that don't exist yet, which is part of our Stand Up 2.0 strategy. So Stand Up 2.0, after we won record contracts at the Big Three, was our announcement to organize all of the unorganized OEMs in the country, which is 14 right now, if you're counting. And very proud to say this week, the International Executive Board voted to allocate $40 million to that effort, which is amazing. And as Dave said, organizing, thank you. It's a massive question of resources, and we need to organize both money and people to do that. So thank you for the EWOC folks who mentioned that also. And we're going to figure out a way to get the organizers we need out there. But if folks have been following the announcements that the Biden administration has made over the last several years, which are loosely called Bidenomics, corporations are in line to get hundreds of billions of dollars of our taxpayer money. And I understand that there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for putting money into infrastructure, for putting money into the just transition that we need to fight climate change. And make no mistake, UAW members want to fight climate change. We want to drink clean drinking water. We want to breathe clean air. But at the same time, what's happening if we don't make an intervention is corporations, the ultra-wealthy, rich corporations, are going to get hundreds of billions of dollars of our taxpayer money, and they're not going to provide good jobs for workers. This is a major issue. And it's not just that. These companies don't have a plan to hire the workers, the thousands of workers that they're going to need to work in these plants. So just taking Arizona as an example, there's currently an existing auto plant in Arizona, folks probably know it, that employs approximately 2,000 auto workers in Casa Grande. I'm not going to say the name. You know it. As part of the federal investments, 3 major battery companies have lined up to open plants here. One is called Core Power, one is called LG Chem, and one is called American Battery Factory. And each one of those companies has announced that they're going to hire 2,000 to 3,000 workers in Arizona. So 2,000 auto workers, another 6,000 to 9,000 people who are going to be building batteries. And then, of course, I'm sure folks have heard of TSMC and Intel. which are each lined up to get tens of billions of dollars of our taxpayer money, probably in the next week or so, and who are going to be hiring thousands of workers, likely 4,000 or 5,000 workers per plant. So that's 9,000 jobs in the auto supply chain that are going to be created in Arizona, and that's just one state of many where this is happening all across the country. And I know the administration has touted that a lot of these are going to be good jobs, and the truth is, for construction workers, some of that's true. There's Davis-Bacon prevailing wage in place for money connected to chips, and there's also some provisions in place through the Department of Energy for EV manufacturers and battery manufacturers who are going to be getting money to build EVs. But the permanent workers who will work in these plants for 10, 20, 30 years, who the UAW represents, there's nothing in place to make sure that those people have good jobs. So part of what we need to do is, I think as everyone has been talking about, we need to organize on a scale that we haven't before if we want to increase density in this country and if we want to see a more progressive, pro-labor vision for our country. But we also need to stop right now and create a movement so that our tax dollars, right, that we work very hard and our members work hard to make every day that we fight for at the bargaining table are going to be creating good jobs. And it's not just about the jobs. This is about how the transition is going to happen and how we're actually going to succeed in fighting climate change. Right now, workers at Ultium, because of the stand-up strike, are going to be making the same amount of money that auto workers building ICE engines make, which is incredible. But before that, before we won that in the negotiations, they were set to get paid $16.50 an hour, while auto workers at the highest salary were getting paid $32 an hour. So workers don't want to do that. I mean, people fight their whole lives. Our union has fought for 80 years to get that salary in our contracts, and people aren't going to give it up. Even though, as I said, everyone wants to breathe clean air, everyone wants to drink clean water. That's an impossible choice for workers to make, right? So we need to build a movement for climate justice that acknowledges that not only is this a movement for climate justice, but this is a movement so that everyone, all workers who participate in the EV supply chain, can have good jobs for them and their families.
Hi everyone, my name's Emma Kinema. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a senior campaign lead with the Communications Workers of America, and I organize our tech and games organizing campaign, which is called Code CWA, the campaign to organize digital employees. I feel like my comments aren't going to be as exciting or dramatic as some of the others, but I think they're still very interesting personally. There's a couple things I'd want to highlight about our work, but first just to give kind of an overview of what Code is. Right now, we've launched Code after a couple years. We've got over 5,000 workers organized in the tech industry. This is a very small number in the scale of, there's tens and hundreds of thousands of workers in the industry, but it's a start. We think organizing in tech is like a very, very important strategic target for CWA in particular because it's a telecommunications union and a media union, and these days, when you look at finance writing, they talk about tech, media, and telecom all in one breath. These are the same companies, oftentimes holding the same kind of subsidiary, companies to account. And anyway, so we've been organizing for the last couple years. We've been doing kind of a model of very worker-centric organizing. So it's very labor-intensive, but once it gets spun up, it works pretty well because you can have very minimal staffing on a campaign while the workers do a lot of the actual work themselves. We've spun up an organizer training program, which is something we kind of think about when it comes to scalability, where in the last couple of years we've trained over 5,000 workers in the tech industry to actually have organizing conversations, build, organizing committees, things like this, and to actually go and reproduce that in their workplace. And not all of those workers who come through are in organized workshops. They are workers at almost entirely unorganized workplaces. And so then they have to go and turn around and do very, very difficult work of trying to organize the unorganized. And many of them, they'll get training and they go off for a couple of months and then they come back out of the woodwork. They've got a little organizing committee and things going, and we support them from there once they show those signs of kind of organizing growth. But for us, we feel like we have to do new organization, even though it's very difficult. And not just new organization in terms of groups of workers and units, but in terms of this new industry tech, which is almost entirely completely unorganized, because a lot of reasons, but, and primarily, tech has an outsized footprint and effect compared to, just who the workers are, right? So for instance, to maybe give an example, we were organizing a group of workers who made minimum wage. There's about 80 of them, and they work on Google Maps. And these workers in particular, if they stopped working for a day, Google Maps would start breaking down and crashing, and entire systems like ambulance, traversal systems for New York would break down based off of this. So, like huge infrastructural power that some of these workers have, right? So that's why CWA, the many members in it voted to put a lot of money and resources into this campaign, even though it's still small and it's growing. We feel like it was a very, very important investment to make. And I think also, not just these workers having leverage, but tech industry is very deeply tied into, I think, all other industries and all other forms of work these days, right? Whether we're talking about AI and automation and things like that, or even just, typical tools that people use in their jobs, all of this is built by the tech industry and by tech workers. And so to us, it's kind of an existential challenge, especially when you think about AI and automation. How do we actually organize the workers who are creating these tools that could so severely impact the rest of the working class? We need to have political consciousness in that group of workers in a way that they haven't really to date. But through the union process, we've seen a lot of kind of workers who might come in with like a very petty bourgeois kind of office worker, professional mentality shift into becoming very, class conscious in a very militant way by, actually testing the boundaries of, their power as a class in their workplace. So it's something that we think is very important politically as well. So one other thing I want to touch on, which has been raised a couple times, is that for us, NLRB elections can be very much a tool in the toolbox, but they're not, in our opinion, a total answer to rebuilding the labor movement. When you think about the scale and history of the labor movement, frankly, collective bargaining is actually a relatively modern, recent development in the way that it's become kind of this unanimous what we think of when we think of unions. But, we have decades and decades and decades and millions of people who've struggled in unions prior to having, for instance, like the National Labor Relations Agreement, right? And so we like to think outside of the NLRB as much as possible as well. And for us, that we call it direct join unionism, our model of organizing, where folks can just join immediately. They don't have to go through the NLRB. They don't have to go through a certification process. They can become union members. They can become exposed to union culture, union organizing skills, and engage in struggle with their coworkers, even though they're not certified as a union. And they can still win gains and make fights with their employers. We think this really lowers the bar of entry, and it means we have higher membership in those campaigns where we use direct join membership compared to, if we were just only limiting kind of who can be a member based off of NLRB campaigns. And to the question of resources that's been raised, it means a huge influx of money, frankly. Like, so for an example, with the Alphabet Workers Union with Google, I think Ben was mentioning it earlier, but we have kind of this division of, very low-income workers in that union, and we also have very high-income workers, your typical, what comes to mind when you think of like a software engineer or tech worker. And those higher level workers can subsidize the organizing of those in the lower strata. And so, we, for instance, were able to, in the space of 1 year, staff up from 0 full-time staff on the Alphabet Workers Campaign to 12 staff full-time who are helping organize that campaign. And that's entirely because of the direct join model that we had. And now we've got, thousands of workers in that union and are actively organizing, all across the entire footprint of Alphabet and all of its subsidiaries. So, right now we've got nearly 2,000 members, and we've got, I think it's like a $3 million budget annually at this point in time. And workers are essentially able to build a union culture and pick fights in a way that institutionalizes successes and failures in a way that they weren't before the union existed, and it was just simple activism on individual issues. And it is worth noting that we do NLRB organizing in Alphabet for individual units and groups of workers who we think it's strategic to do that with. But it's not the entire model, right? So we put class struggle first and foremost over, going through the typical NLRB process. And lastly, I kind of want to wrap up with one last thought, which is we've been able to connect to the rest of the labor movement, these new tech workers who are very young. They have lots of diverse skill sets. When they come into the new union locals and things, they bring all these skill sets that benefit the locals and benefit existing CWA membership, but also connecting out to groups like Unite Here, where we helped organize a group in Boston of service workers at the Alphabet campus there who were unorganized before. We helped organize that. And we've also participated with tech organizing around Palestine with JVP and other organizations and other legislative political work. So having a union, having a big, robust membership with dues coming in means we can do organizing on a bigger scale than they would be able to otherwise. And I'll just wrap by saying, that FTE TVC divide that Ben was talking about before, the full-time employees and the temp and vendor contract workers, I think is really essential because we're able to bridge multiple companies where modern companies often, like we were talking about yesterday, they're fractured into all these different service, companies that kind of do one piece of the product. We organize across vendor companies. We organize across the entire footprint of Alphabet, even if they're not owned by Alphabet proper, and they're all union members as well. And they can just, again, directly join the union and, engage in organizing campaigns directly with us and access those resources that we have. So it kind of bridges class divides in, I think, a very meaningful way across the tech industry as a whole. I'll wrap there. But yeah, thank you.
So I'm really glad to have all these people with us today to talk about the work they're doing. And the reason that they're here and the reason that a lot of other people have been here talking on these panels is because at the center we really think in a pretty specific way about how to tackle this problem. I used to be an organizer. I think a bit like an organizer. I don't want to overplay this. Ben Tracy from Healthcare Rising Arizona last night referred to me as an almost good organizer, which was ungenerous, but probably accurate. But I do think this way. As a sociologist, I pay a lot of attention to organizations, how they change, how they develop. Jerry Davis was asked to open this whole thing to sort of frame how the world of organizations is changing. And I want to point out a very important thing. We've talked some about the CIO in here. Ben is doing a podcast. I think Andrew is working on a podcast as well on the CIO. The CIO wasn't just an effort to build unions and put workers in the unions. They were trying to solve the problem of the vertically integrated corporation. And they needed to build new kinds of union organizations to tackle these massive, unprecedented organizations that had massive resources. How do you build unions to deal with that problem? Well, Jerry was pointing out to us yesterday that That's not what they look like anymore. They're kind of nimble, weird, unaccountable, flexible. They're like, you're trying to like get a hold of them and you can't, right? You could easily imagine, and we've seen this in a lot of industries, unions go through the trouble to organize something, say a Starbucks shop, and Starbucks just closes it down rather than negotiate with their workers, right? These are getting hard to get a handle on, right? The reason that the people are here talking is because they are trying to deal with the organizational question in some way or another, or they are pointing the way towards new ways of doing the work. So one way of dealing with the problem of 1.5 million workers a year, or 1.5 million workers per point of gain in union representation, is to throw money at the problem. Some unions, I think you actually basically have a napkin number. It costs $1,000 to organize a worker through an election. Doesn't mean they get a contract, and that's if you're good at organizing, right? Well, that's a number, and you can look at that and you go, well, 1.5 million workers, that's a lot of dollars. And unions have resources. They don't really have that kind of resources, right? So then the question is, what are other ways to solve the organizational issues? You can do your work better. You can build different kinds of organizations. You can also collaborate better, or you can leverage other opportunities, right? So Emergency Workers Organizing Committee is here because they remind me of the way some private sector companies have been successful. So Jerry will probably know what I'm talking about here. There were some great studies done in the 2000s of the beer industry. Well, a very interesting thing happened in the beer industry. So it was dominated by massive vertically integrated corporations like Anheuser-Busch, and a bunch of people who were basically home brewers come along, they start doing craft beers, and they build these little companies, and they basically wipe out the vertically integrated companies. People who come to my house tonight, you will probably be drinking some craft beer, okay? It's not gonna be a lot of Budweiser in the house. And it's an interesting example of where the little player managed to disrupt and beat the big player, right? And EWOC reminds me a little bit of that. Small but effective, finding a niche, not trying to do everything, but do one thing well, and actually able to leverage very limited resources into considerable success. It's not $1,000 per worker anymore. They're changing the nature of the problem, right? In Minneapolis, I have been blown away, not just by George Floyd Square and the wonderful people there, the imaginative, original people there, but also the fact that in the wake of the uprising, there's been a labor movement revival in Minneapolis. All of a sudden, unions are thinking and talking differently, and I've interviewed a number of labor leaders in Minneapolis, and they all say more or less the same thing, which is, the uprising taught us how to fight again. Well, that's a pretty simple thing. And so we have Shaywall here from 1199 New York. 1199 New York was built in the middle of the civil rights movement and leveraged the civil rights movement opportunity into building one of the largest local unions in the country, one of the most effective local unions in the country, 1199 New York. Has 400,000 members now, basically represents the entire private sector hospital industry, et cetera, et cetera. Very few local unions have that kind of power. So, what I want to point out to all of you is you're all being organizationally imaginative. And I'm going to borrow a phrase from another GFSer, Janelle Austin, but I would often ask Janelle why she is able to figure out solutions to the problems that she confronts George Floyd Square, George Floyd Global Memorial, and her own work as a preservationist in the square. She would say takes PBS imagination. And that's referring to people who would sit in front of, we would watch Sesame Street, Electric Company, these other shows, which were basically about teaching kids about possibility and how to recognize it and how to move things forward in those moments of opportunity. All of you are up here because there's a bit of PBS imagination in what you're doing. Does that make sense? Okay. I'll also point out UHW. UHW is not doing what EWOC is, and it's sort of on the opposite end of the organizational size scale, but what UHW is doing is using their resources to try stuff, to just do stuff in a different way, okay? So the number of organizations that UHW has spun off seems slightly extraordinary to me, and Dave only talked about, there are other ones, right? I'm not wrong in saying that. The Fairness Project is massively successful at delivering huge amounts of resources, redistributing wealth in an active way to working people, right? Healthcare Rising Arizona is an interesting experiment that's not just about building an organization of people in Arizona, it's also to help make Arizona more amenable to working people, to regular people, flip it blue, have a political impact in the long term that doesn't involve just electing Democratic officials, right? So, we've also heard from a number of panelists about this, and I want to point out one or two things about that. So Barry Idland's work thinking about, well, how do we actually think about these different tensions in organizations? It's a fantastic example of this. Craig and Kim were having a conversation about what a movement is. Movements aren't just the organizations. Any number of sociologists will study movements by looking at the relevant organizations. That doesn't mean they have captured the movement, right? Movement happens in lots of non-formally organized forms. Last year, Cedric De Leon was here, and he was talking about how we need to imagine an eclectic labor movement, right? And eclecticism isn't just trying lots of other, it's not just working together, it's also trying lots of things. It's enabling the kind of activity that can incubate innovation, right? New ways of doing things, new ways of being effective, and so on. Right. And I want to refer to one other person that we had last year, Ruth Milkman, who was talking about one of these basic problems, but I think some of you were trying to solve this. She had some really nice data, which was showing, when we think about what Andrew would suggest is a new consciousness of class rather than a new class consciousness, people are talking about unions. They're talking about organizing. One of the interesting things is that the people that are most newly supportive of unions are not union members. They're young people. Young people are not overrepresented in unions. They are underrepresented in unions. Union members tend to be old, right? And so one of the questions is the activity that you're doing also bridging this basic gap, right? Are we reaching the people that want to be in unions? It's very clear to me that what EWOC is doing that. And a basic problem would be scale, right? Now saying that, it's also important to recognize that organizing opportunities are not just with young people. So healthcare workers are furious. They went through the pandemic. They're pissed off. I mean, UHW doesn't need to reach new kinds of workers. There's millions of healthcare workers in this country that can be organized, right? And that's something that they are probably going to be occupied with for the foreseeable future. But all of this requires a little bit of PBS imagination about how we organize, how we build organizations, not just one-on-one meetings, but also how do we build structures that are able to think about new ways of doing this kind of thing. So with that in mind, I want to ask all of you to respond a little bit to what I'm saying, but also to respond to each other. Do you see in the work that you're doing things that you might be able to adapt, collaborate with, new ways of thinking about how you do work in your own union, so on like that you get inspiration from or that you'd like to see more of? Why don't I start with somebody in particular, Scott? I should mention one of the innovative things that are going on in Scott's union is actually not that new, but the rank and file caucus, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, has been instrumental in the transformation of the IBT, right? But why don't you take it away?
Sure. So I guess I'll probably have the least innovative thing to say about anyone. So I have sort of the most traditionalist approach, I guess, here. I think on the question of the kinds of workplaces we're looking at, like I found Jerry's presentation fascinating and I want to read your book. At the same time, I do think that there are industries and there are certain legal structures that are being challenged, say at the NLRB right now, that actually push back against that a little bit, which is particularly relevant when you look at firms like Amazon that rely on joint employment status that are largely fictive and what David Wild calls a fissured workplace. And I think that there are sort of legal solutions to that put organizing in a more traditional context there, where we're looking at big strategic targets that are existential threats and trying to leverage the member organizers that we have and the funds that are available to take them on. So I guess, in some ways, I do think innovatively, I mean, I know there's been part of the labor upsurge and the new kind of consciousness of class that isn't translating into any new numbers that's been happening, is that we have seen a number of reform caucuses arise in lots of different unions. Obviously UAWD, who I work closely with, throughout the election, and we are partners with them, and that's obviously had a big opportunity for opening things up. But again, what these movements can accomplish has to be complemented by so much more. They're just kind of opening the door, but they don't actually get us anywhere. They just make things possible, I think. So I think, that's what I want to stress about, having internal dissension and the democracy, like Barry's talking about, opens the door, but like we have to have these strategies that everybody else is talking about to actually take that further, and serious strategic targeting too as well. So,
Marcia, Gretta.
I think what you were just saying, having a diversity of tactics and diversity of strategies is really, really important. And in order to garner the attention and the energy from people who might be outside of traditional unions, bargaining for the common good and being very public about what you're doing for climate, what you're doing for housing, what you're doing for livable wage, what you're doing for just decent jobs. I think that's going to play well in Peoria or in just the street. So when we're trying to get young folks really, really enthusiastic about forming a union or going for a union job, journeyman, whatever, I think making sure that we keep them in the forefront of our mind. I think someone mentioned about the employees that have yet to be hired, the people that don't exist yet. They may have been born, but we have school children who they just know that they're going to go into a union. And I kind of feel bad by saying, it's not that many unions out there, as much as it feels that way where they live. But maybe it could be. It could be. Give it enough time.
Daphna and Grace, or Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, so just on innovation, and everyone was remarking on Jerry's presentation yesterday, but for us, the auto industry is changing. ICE engines, as EVs become a more dominant vehicle, are going to replace the jobs that our members currently have, and they're going to spin off lots of different companies, right? They're going to spin off battery companies. Intel estimates that 20% of the value of a car is going to be a semiconductor by the year 2030. So we also have to expand, and sorry if I used a term of art, I said OEM, but that's like original equipment manufacturer. Those are the classic car companies that everyone thinks of, right? And they're called OEMs because, a long time ago now, they started to spin off all of these other companies that would make their parts. And so the OEM was just essentially became the company that made final assembly. And those are the brands that we know. And so, we're trying to build a movement that, is going across our membership, not just auto workers, but higher ed workers, everyone who cares about climate change, to get together and say, the best way that this transition can happen is when we have worker-led industrial policy where workers are at the table, and the best way to facilitate that is through collective bargaining. And we can't win that, we're not going to win a union through legislation or through a ballot measure. We're going to have to organize. We're going to have to get 50% plus one every single time. But if we can leverage labor peace agreements, card check neutrality agreements to help remove employer opposition, that's going to be a really important force for driving that forward.
So let me say one other thing here about the eclectic labor movement. For an eclectic labor movement to be value added, right, rather than unions just doing what they do, or unions doing what they do better, or whatever that might be, an eclectic labor movement opens the door to the possibility that unions collaborate with each other and other organizations, worker centers, EWOC, whatever it might be, in new and different ways. And one concern I have is are unions still just trying to do it all internally, or are they imagining new ways of relating to other organizations and other like EWOC or other kinds of organizations? We heard about C-Tool earlier. It's an organization that all the Minneapolis people know well. C-Tool is doing this kind of work. Other worker centers do that kind of work. Are we imagining that as well, not just what we're doing internally? So.
Well, and just to briefly respond to that, and then I'll pass it along. We're working with Jobs to Move America, which I know Ben had in his presentation but didn't really go into, to try to build community coalitions in areas where there are a lot of these jobs coming in, so that we're not just winning neutrality or project labor agreements, We're also winning, priority hire for people from disadvantaged communities. We're winning environmental protections that the community wants, right? So that it to your point, it isn't just about us, but it's what we can wrap into an agreement that helps everyone in the community.
Two quick things, just from what people said earlier. And Daphna, you said your numbers, didn't sound like they were that big, and I thought your numbers were impressive. So I was impressed, and I think it's really interesting and cool. But I thought that was great. And then Gretta, you said something that just talking about your strike, and it was celebratory and music and frankly, that's what's happened this past year in all of these strikes. And, we had this strike at Kaiser, and it was like 50 block parties going on for 3 days, and people had DJs and food trucks and, and to me, there's something about that that's meaningful. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's meaningful, and just what people have pent up in them that needed to come out. And just on this, I think what is definitely lacking, and this is about how do we relate to each other and how do we take advantage of opportunities that are there. I'm really into this student assistant thing. There's another unit at the UC system, and then what I think is really cool is that local union has identified big campaigns, big possibilities that are totally doable. And, and somehow the rest of us have to all be aware and help and pitch in and do it. And what doesn't exist right now, and I don't think it happens maybe it happens in Minneapolis, it doesn't happen, I think, in most of the country, where people who do what we all do get together and talk about what's possible, not in a theoretical, esoteric sense, but say, here is a target that we think we can do, and it's real, and here's why. And, because there is just a simple arithmetic thing that's going on here. In our world, we think there are campaigns that are possible, weren't possible before, and I think we would all benefit just from hearing from each other and creating venues where people talk about that in, I'm making this up, but in Indiana, there are doable campaigns numbering 25,000 people, and here are what the targets are. In Minnesota, it's this, and, the tech industry in California, it's that. And, nobody talked to each other. We went through that weird period with the pandemic, and everybody was on Zoom, and everybody was bunkered down, and now people are coming out of it. And I just think the conditions are different, and we have to intentionally create more venues and not leave it to the established structures. I don't think this conversation is going to happen at most AFL-CIO bodies. I don't think it's going to happen in many, in certain unions. And I think people who care about this, it's a small world, and we got to seek each other out and try to do this together, because, there's just more that's possible. And so it's really not quote unquote innovation, but I think I would argue that the current conditions and what's possible demands us to be intentional in how we interact with each other and seek each other out and try to be supportive. And I do think there's this idea that there's more coming at us right now. That's what I'm taking from a lot of these presentations than people can keep up with. It's a target-rich environment, and we need to behave differently in addition to doing some other things differently.
I think for me, when I think about, block parties in the streets when people are on strike and things like that, that's to me what the actual heart of the labor movement should be. I think it's a real shame that we kind of gatekeep our movement. I think we kind of have a way too high bar of entry. Whether it's, we break it down as it's $1,000 per worker to get them into the union, essentially. Or, the hurdle of, NLRB certification. I think like we need to channel much more of that cultural aspect of unionism, and I think back to like the profound impact that unions have had on different communities, and I'm thinking about like the Flint strike of '37. That campaign started at a 1.5% membership rate, and they had local stewards and presidents, and they had a union culture that was vibrant and things, even though it was small. That laid the foundation and enabled the massive expansion of the Flint strike, that became, a majority action over time and obviously led to amazing things. And so I think we need to let people just into our movement in a way. And, I think people will be happy to do that. People will be happy to volunteer and donate their dues and contribute even if they don't have bargaining rights. That's the thing on my mind.
I really like the idea of don't gatekeep the movement. I think that's it's obviously resonating with a lot of people here. Yeah, Daphna and Grace.
Is this working? Hello? Okay. Hello. I want to say that I didn't talk about this before, and maybe that was a strange oversight on my part, but the thing that I do at EWOC is I'm the labor educator, and I run trainings, and we have had thousands of workers come through our trainings. And what's interesting about that is that, back in 2020, I went to one of our trainings when I was organizing early childhood educators in New York City. And there were 90 of us in those trainings. We came every week, and it was 6 weeks at the time. I run them in 4 weeks. And one of the people that was there was a nurse. She was a nurse in Texas in a 600 nurse unit in Ascension Seton in Austin, and she took the training with me, and a year later they went public, and I don't even remember exactly which month they wound up voting for their union, but they are now a recognized union, and they're fighting for their contract, and they've gone on strike. And she's come back, and she's now taught our training. And I think what's interesting about that is that isn't reflected in our numbers at all, because we didn't support her along the way. She did all the lifting on her own, which workers can do. And I think that's a big lesson for us, which is that workers themselves, with just a little bit of training, can flourish. And I think if I had to say one thing to labor in general, in terms of taking that lesson, is, well, one, believe that, and two, build a relationship with us, I would say. Have a relationship with EWOC. Make us part of your plan. And I'd say that even though, I believe that every union is going to be trying out different things, and I think that's really important, I also think that we need to cut against all the turf wars and all the, divisions, and we need to say, well, everything is part of the same plan. I was really inspired by what you were saying that was happening at MFD, like taking on and being the home for all these other unions. And I want our workers that come to us to be later in your unions. That's our goal. We want you to be stronger. We want unions to be stronger, and we see ourselves as part of that. And I'll just say, we don't have to think all the time about the economics of it, because we just run on so much power of volunteers. And speaking of volunteers, I have Bill and I have Shasta's over there, and Shasta has our flyers. We have little trifolds. You can take a stack, and if you ever find a worker that you think, we can't take that campaign, but they could reach out to EWOC, they could get training, and I just feel like that would be really great for building a more of a connective tissue between what it is that you're doing in your unions and what it is that we're trying to do.
I like that. All right, just briefly, this is calling back to what Dave was talking about with the undergraduate student workers. in my OPEIU job, in that capacity, I do a lot of undergrad student organizing, and I believe so strongly in it because we now at OPEIU represent undergraduate student workers at Emerson, Smith, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Fordham, Wesleyan, Barnard, University of Pennsylvania. I might be missing a few others, but we have student groups who are organized, who have collective bargaining units or are in the middle of bargaining their CBAs at their universities right now, who are about to graduate and go into the workforce, and they now see the labor movement as a possibility, as a real thing. And so we have nowhere near 15,000. We have a lot of undergraduate worker groups, but as many student workers who can be part of this, I think there was a lot of pushback at OPEIU, there still is, about how much we are investing in that. I say we got to invest more because those people are going to graduate and are going to be demanding more and are going to be willing to talk with their coworkers in a way we've never seen before. So I just wanted to make a plug for that.
So,
Michael, could
yeah.
I just add one thing?
Sure.
Thanks. Okay. You know, we're talking a lot about organizing the unorganized. And one thing we are doing well, and we haven't talked about actually, is organizing the organized. So when we went on strike, we brought our ESPs, our hourly workers, alongside us. If you saw any teacher on the strike line, they said, I'm out here for our hourly workers. Then we were able to bring on, in the middle of our strike, we were able to get our food service workers to take a strike vote. We were like, this is the time. If you're ever going to win, jump on now. Now we have ongoing weekly meetings with the other bargaining units, and our alignment across the cities right now is from getting in a room and saying, when does your contract expire? When is your contract? And making sure that we are all aligned. And yeah, and like that is just so important. And also just scare your bosses. Like our unions, our teachers' unions in Minnesota are very organized. And all of our contracts expire on the same day. And we all filed to bargain around the same time. So this year, just to freak out the boss, we held a massive press conference, all filed to bargain at the exact same time on the exact same day. And you know what? It didn't do anything, like for us, like at all to help us, but it freaked out the whole state to think that we were that aligned. So like organizing the organized is so essential to this movement as well.
Yeah, the idea of magnifying power just by organizing between unions better is tremendously promising, right? That's amazing. All right, I want to include the audience. This is a conversation about solving the order of magnitude problem with the resources that are available, and that will require some degree of imagination. But why don't we start with Barry?
Yeah, hi. This has been a really fantastic conversation. I'm really glad that this is framed around the order of magnitude problem that Dave framed really nicely for us. And I think it's useful to think historically about this, going back to the CIO and just to get a sense of what order of magnitude we're talking about, right? So we recently celebrated the 87th anniversary of the end of the Flint sit-down strike in February of 1937. And between February of 1937 and I think June or July, the UAW went from a handful of members to 300,000 members in a few months. And then around that same time, SWAC went, because they freaked out, U.S. Steel, we got another 200,000 members. So 1937, the labor movement basically added like 500,000 members in the first 6 months of 1937, basically. So for us, I think, well, it speaks to the energy, but it also, there's a question of like, how do you actually So I think there's some lessons to be learned that I actually haven't researched. Maybe some others have, like how they actually absorb those people, right? Like I don't even know. So like assuming we can get that kind of energy, because that was not $1,000 per member. That was, so there was actually some of the interesting research I did was like looking at what happened in Canada. And when the CIO started taking off like that, there were workers in Canada who had nothing to do with the CIO, who were just like, oh, we're the CIO. And then like people in DC or wherever who were with the CIO were like, who are these people up in Canada? I guess like, I don't know, but they're saying the CIO, maybe we need to send somebody up there. But meanwhile, they had already organized, right? But but the thing I want to bring out there is how you actually, because they absorb that into some sort of infrastructure. And so I think that that's worth thinking about. The second point I want to make is that when we talk about the 1930s, we often talk about the pinnacles of industry. We talk about steel, auto, and how we no longer have these vertically integrated industries. But another big part of the massive organizing of that period is things that I think are much more germane to where we are now. And thinking, because I think a lot of the history of organizing over the past 150 years is really fighting this game that management plays of hide the boss. And it has taken a whole different variety of forms in the different periods. And we know the ones today. But you think about beyond auto and steel and mining, you think about organizing the docks. You think about organizing textile. You think about organizing Hollywood. You think about organizing trucking. A lot of the work that went into those campaigns was essentially creating a boss to fight. And I think that that's a lot of what we have to do today in terms of our organizing challenge is essentially creating a boss to fight. And that's going to be a big challenge for the organizing we have today.
You ain't never lied. It is important to create a boss to fight, having a human personification, an avatar of the organization or the corporation that you are fighting against. Quite frankly, generally they give you somebody with a big mouth, or somebody who's the face, or somebody who's across from you at the bargaining table when you're being televised, and then they sort of throw themselves onto the pyre. And so it's like, batter up. There's, the adage, there's no better organizer than a bad boss. So someone who is desultory or arrogant or just dismissive of the concerns of the worker, they wind up, well, if you mess around with Gretta, you wind up not having a job after that campaign. So, because that's what happened during our strike. Quite a few heads rolled, metaphorically, and we flipped our school board as well. There were analysts, and the school superintendent became, we didn't villainize him, he was a villain. And
I villainized him.
There were memes, there were political cartoons, there was a cabaret show with, no, seriously, a Wildcat Cabaret, so a union, theater show with this person. And so it was very gratifying that not only did we win, but we also got rid of people that we felt were standing in the way of the rights of the worker. And so that's a concern with alphabet corporations. Like, you can't go so far up that your arms don't reach. And you can't just pick someone that it looks like a gambit instead of something real. But quite frankly, all of these organizations and corporations do have human people that are making decisions. And so any, mini, miny, mo, pick one and find a boss to fight, because that actually inspires people.
Okay, Shaughnessy.
This has been really, really inspiring about, innovative ideas. And I'm curious, even though, I totally agree as an organizer to pick a boss to fight, and it's so much easier to organize people to do it, in an increasingly segmented and global economy, have you considered what the component would be globally to be sure that we can build power? I know it's a little bit easier to imagine in manufacturing or supply chains, but more and more there are influences beyond our borders on everything.
I don't have the whole answer to this, but it just keeps reminding me of my favorite Paul Wellstone quote, which is, sometimes if you want to win a fight, you have to pick one. And so it's like, choose who that fight is with, but you're going to have to pick the fight, whoever that's going to be.
Ben Fong.
I have a question about the connective tissue that Daphna just mentioned. One of the things I appreciate about EWOC is that it seeks to be an organizing intermediary and to connect organizations and people who don't normally talk to one another. I guess my question is sort of about the connective tissue that already exists that we don't necessarily encounter. So to go back to Jerry's presentation that started us off yesterday, he showed us Ford's River Rouge plant and the fact that you could see the strategic choke points, right? You shut down the motor factory. It's right there. Everyone can see it, right? In the logistics clusters that Scott showed us just now, these are big, right? We're talking 30, 40,000 workers concentrated in a pretty tight area, but there's no motor building, right? There's all these little links in the process that are extremely vulnerable given modern supply chains, but we just don't necessarily know where the things are. And I would guess that part of the issue is that there are linkages, industry linkages, that overlap between the different organizations that you all represent that aren't necessarily targeted. So I guess like my question is, are there industry linkages that you all can think of that aren't being explored that could be? So, I mean, just one that I'm just spitballing right now. But, you know, the kind of software that goes into the automated sorting in various facilities, right, distribution facilities. Google Maps. It sort of seems like there's some overlap with logistics organizing in ways that the unions could collaborate, not because they just want to share knowledge, but because their industries are actually linked in a way that they need to collaborate. So, yeah, just the question is about links that are already there that need to be explored further.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so I think it's a good question. I have something less to say maybe about the links between industries, except it sort of does connect with tech, though. I mean, one of the most interesting organizing victories in the past year, to me at least, is at UPS we still have non-union workers that are new positions that were created because of the technology that goes into the automation to create the distribution networks as they exist now. So they call them specialists. And these are people who basically work at the digital interface. And if you don't have them, the entire productivity gains of automation falls apart immediately. There are about 11,000 of them nationwide. We have about 300 organized right now in Louisville. And we got a neutrality agreement to work on them. And what you find when you talk to other companies in this industry is that these same positions exist. So these are like interface or digital choke points that have immense power to do we're all thinking about what are different ways to get the company to the table that aren't just pushing everyone through an NLRB election. And the power that you wield from some of these points has potential but is unexplored. So, not exactly an answer because it's within one industry, but I do think that, these kind of tech connections exist and are increasingly important. We just have to find them.
Other questions or comments? Yeah, Hortensia.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Hortensia with SEIU UHW, and this is for EWOC. Very interested here. It says graduates who aren't in a position to organize their workplace get opportunities to put their new skills to use by supporting other workers who reach out to EWOC. We have a lot of organizing openings at UHW because we've made a shift. Our executive board is an executive board where you lead by taking action, and they are building a brigade of 600 lost timers, but Dave already laid out some of the challenges, but maybe it would be good to talk about potential partnerships where they could come and check out our campaigns and see if they could work with us in partnership or, because we're out there looking for organizers. This is not a job where people are knocking at the doors and saying, I want to be an organizer, right? We have to go out and build organizers. And just the fact that you have a training pool of people, I think it's very impressive.
I'll
just respond quickly and say that one of the things that always makes me chuckle when I accept all the people who sign up for our trainings is that a lot of people who sign up don't necessarily know what organizing even is. So they might say something like, I keep a very organized office. My desktop is amazing. And it's something we lead with every training is like, what is organizing? Well, organizing is building community. And for people who are already in the trenches of doing this, it's so obvious that we forget sometimes to slow down and explain, what you're trying to do is build a community, and community that has the power and the democratic structure to bring about changes that most people want to see. And I think in that way, on the unions like the ones represented here are kind of on the front line of challenging some of the ways that unions have come to be viewed and have actually acted that are less productive, and because I think they sometimes shy away from that kind of messy, democratic, engaged membership, and they definitely shy away from spending as much as you're willing to spend on organizing. So what we want to bring into the movement, and I think that creates something that can be transferable from different kinds of situations, different workplaces, is those types of organizers who know how to act democratically. And, to say, absolutely, we would love to train people and send them and have places where they can organize other people, because I think a lot of people that come to EWOC, well, then they try to organize their workplace. They may or may not have success, but they have learned a lot. They've cut their teeth on organizing their own workplace, and they are ready to go and get jobs as organizers in other places. And there's I think a lot of people like that.
Other questions or comments? John
Hi.
Bruggeman.
Hi, this is Sonia.
Sorry, Sonia, yeah.
That's okay. SEIU. I just had a question in terms of, we're talking about organizing and we're talking about capacity as well. Has there been any thought about organizing or collaborating with existing unions in your area to go out and target areas together for more volume?
So the way that we usually relate to workers and to unions is we don't go out and find workers, they come to us. Oh, sorry, did I misunderstand the question?
Just a question to all the unions up there. Are you utilizing unions in court organizing and connecting and collaborating with unions in your area to create more volumes, to go out and do more recruitment, to organize the unorganized?
I think it means collaboration
Across unions, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Even if it's, for example, we're going to organize, we're doing a lot of organizing in San Diego, Sacramento, or maybe reaching out to other unions in those areas to create a partnership to target a certain area. We're doing medicals, we're doing hospitals that are unorganized. Maybe we collaborate with others to get volume and get perspective. So you're training them, but you're still reaching more people.
Yeah, one thing that we've been working on that we've been very proud of the support we've gotten from other unions and absolutely want to reciprocate it is through political organizing. So, we're on the doors every election cycle. Everyone who works for a union, knows that's true. And we have opportunities to talk to workers at every single door about, where they work and what their working conditions are like, and if they're interested in talking to other workers who want to form a union. And so we've been coordinating with some other labor councils and other unions, in specific areas where we think large concentrations of auto workers and EV workers live. And so that's something that we at least want to do more of. And we definitely, for other unions that have targets, know where people live, we absolutely want to help where we can.
John Brueggemann?
I can't hear John as I said that never here. Hi, my name is John Brueggemann. I teach sociology at the School of
It's not on. Sorry, I faked you out, man. I'm sorry about that.
Here we go.
Once again, hi. My name is John Brueggemann. I teach sociology at Skidmore College, and I want to thank all the panelists. It's just been such an interesting conference. Religious organizations have been really important in the labor movement over the decades, and I wonder if the Industrial Areas Foundation has partnered very successfully with religious organizations in recent decades, and I wonder if any of the folks here have had connections with religious organizations in your collaborations.
Well, we didn't. And when we went on strike, a lot of religious organizations came out, hit the streets, and supported us very publicly. And so because of that, we've been able to maintain ongoing relationships. But it really happened organically, not because of good organizing that we did.
Although I would say now that we have established those relationships, we are actively maintaining them. So when I talk about the community member meetings, we reach out to different religious organizations to do sign-on letters. So if we're doing a letter, we'll do something, yes to Outfront or yes to M&A, the Nurses Association, and we'll also ask these religious organizations to sign on. And so there is starting to be that sort of, not reciprocity because that feels transactional, but this idea of coalition building and community building, because these are religious organizations in our community that we serve. So yeah, we have.
Yeah, and then just very briefly on the Teamster side, certainly with preparations for the UPS strikes, there were areas of the country where religious organizations were very involved. But more broadly to your question, like getting back to this question of what we can do innovatively and what resources do we have to build off of, like, right, why are religious institutions important socially? Because they're civic organizations that involve people, deal with social atomization, put us in a better position to act collectively. And I think we have an immense resource in all of our organizations to be like taking that aspect of unionization and trying to extend that much further. So just one initiative we have in the IBT is to try to create these things we call future committees, where it's actually an idea from Jackie Presser, who used to negotiate into contracts a recreation fund, companies paying in so that the union could host bowling leagues, events, things like that. So Presser wasn't all bad, but the point being, we try to engage younger members, expand in these programs, and really understand the union as like we don't have much, but we have something to build off of here for rebuilding civic society and going further. And I think the religious institutions often provide like a really good model for how to do that. So.
All right, we are over time a little bit. We are not going. Oh, Ben Tracy. I was wondering when you were going to weigh in.
I didn't want to. But I'm going to. That's right. I have lots of thoughts, but I'm going to try to keep it to one thing that's on my mind. I have the pleasure of getting to hear Dave talk about the things that keep him up at night as a part of this larger UHW family. And there are things that keep me up at night. Most recently, since October, my mom passed away on October 6th of last year. 65 years old, colon cancer, terrible way to go. And in the middle of the summer last year, in one of the conversations that we had as she knew she was on her way out, she shared a story that she hadn't shared before about how she had had a chance to organize. She was an LPN at Methodist Hospital in Peoria, Illinois, and she had a chance to organize back in the 80s and didn't take it. She and her fellow healthcare workers didn't take the shot. And in that moment, she was expressing her regret at having not, taken advantage of a window of opportunity, or however you want to look at it, because she knew that the impact it could have had on our lives growing up, on her life, how she was cared for at the end of everything. It could have been the difference between her dying last year and still being alive now, right? There's a lot of stuff to unpack in my brain. But, when Dave talks about there's a moment, when he says that, like, it's real, there's a moment, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, right? We don't have 5 years to put together councils of local unions across the country who can agree on this is how we're going to move forward. And a lot of organizing for many years has been under cover of night. Like we sneak up on the employer and pop open a campaign, and we can't do that. If it's 1.5 million people, we're talking to millions of people. That's got to be in the open. One of the things that we have to change about the way that we do business with the workers we're trying to organize is we got to bring it to them, and we got to be public about it. We got to declare our presence and bring them to the party, right? Like these strike lines were these amazing opportunities for people to get solidarity, to get to know one another, to cross all sorts of cultural boundaries. And that should not be lost on us, and we should figure out more ways to be louder and prouder and out there. And there's not a thing that a person in this room could do that would be more important than going and talking to another person about joining a union. And how do we do that? How do we make that our purpose coming out of here, and how do we make that our purpose over the next 2 years, 3 years, however long the window is open? And that's the thing that's keeping me up at night is we get this one shot maybe, and are we gonna are we gonna grab onto it and make something happen here? And I feel like we have to, and it'll be a shame if we don't.
You good with that? Yeah, all right, we're going to let Ben close us out? Yeah. All right. Everybody, thank you so much for attending the Center for Work and Democracy's conference this year. It's been an honor to have you. I hope you've made new connections, met new people, and I hope we're able to be in relationship with you going forward over the next few years. And with that, I will close us out. Be well. We will be in touch.